For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 4634, the Terrorism Risk Insurance Program Reauthorization Act of 2019 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4634, a bill to reauthorize the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act of 2002 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, and the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks on this legislation and to insert extraneous material thereon.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, is recognized.
I'm very pleased that we are considering H.R. 4634 to reauthorize the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, or TRIA, for 7 years. This is a bipartisan bill that passed unanimously out of our committee. I would like to thank Chairwoman Maloney, Chairman Clay, and Chairman Cleaver for their efforts to bring this bill to the floor today. I would also like to thank Ranking Member McHenry for working with me to ensure the availability of affordable terrorism risk insurance coverage across our country for small businesses, nonprofit organizations, hospitals, and educational institutions, to name just a few of the entities that rely on this federal program. The Terrorism Risk Insurance Act was enacted in the aftermath of the tragic September 11th terrorism attacks, which resulted in the largest insured losses on record from a non-natural event. Insurance and reinsurance companies reeled from the losses, and terrorism risk insurance became unavailable or extremely expensive, complicating the recovery effort due to the importance of insurance in many business transactions. Congress passed TRIA to ensure that terrorism risk insurance coverage would remain available and affordable, and since that time, the program has been effective at doing just that. Treasury data show the program has been successful, with nearly 80% of all TRIA-eligible policies, including terrorism risk coverage, and policyholders paying an average of only 2.5% of their total premiums for terrorism risk coverage. Treasury data also demonstrates that TRIA is important across America and not just in densely populated urban areas. In fact, the take-up rate is higher in the Midwest than it is in the Northeast. This bill is supported by a broad coalition of over 300 organizations, including the American Property Casualty Insurance Association, the Reinsurance Association of America, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the American Bankers Association. I understand that the Senate Banking Committee is considering identical legislation this week, and I hope that we can act quickly to get this bill signed into law. I would urge all my colleagues to support this important legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from California reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield myself such time as I may consume. Today, I rise in support of H.R. 4634, the Terrorism Risk Insurance Program Reauthorization Act of 2019. For the last 17 years, TRIA has provided an important federal backstop for businesses that insure against the large-scale devastation caused by terrorist attacks. The federal backstop provides much-needed stability for the private terrorism risk insurance market, ensuring that small and large businesses alike have access to affordable coverage. Without federal involvement, the private market cannot adequately price for this type of risk, causing insurers to exit the market and leaving businesses without coverage. That would be a market failure, and it necessitates us acting in order to ensure that market failure does not persist. That's why we have this important program. That bipartisanship continues today, with Republicans and Democrats alike agreeing on the need to reauthorize the TRIA program for an additional 7 years. This long-term extension will give certainty to insurance markets, businesses, and the broader American economy. A wide range of businesses have come to rely on the protections included in this act. From real estate to manufacturing to entertainment, H.R. 4634 will help these companies insure against acts of terrorism. In addition, the bill takes the first step in understanding how the TRIA program can be modernized to meet the advances made by our adversaries in the 21st century. When we began our bipartisan conversations regarding the TRIA reauthorization, I emphasized the need to study how this program would react in the aftermath of a wide-scale cyber attack. We generally know what the threats are, broadly, but how the threats will evolve over the next 7 years, we need to know. We don't know, but what we do know is that America's public and private infrastructure is currently under attack every single day. And so we want to make sure that we are broadly set for this next generation of attack. In the aftermath of 9/11, insurance companies and policymakers quickly became aware of the hidden risks that acts of terrorism could pose to their balance sheets. It was a hidden risk then. Insurers also realized that they would be unable to adequately price this risk, spurring the need for federal assistance. What I'm concerned about is this. I'm concerned a large-scale cyber attack could pose these same hidden risks to insurers and to the market, since we don't fully understand the effects of a large-scale cyber attack and how that would play out today. Moreover, the digital capabilities of our adversaries only continue to grow. Just look at Russia. In 2015, a Russian cyber attack shut down Ukraine's power grid for as long as 6 hours. It's not Russia. If it's not Russia, it's China, Iran, North Korea. State sponsors of terror want to cause as much damage to the United States as they can. And that's not just the government sphere or utilities. It's every part of our economy. It's our duty to make sure that this program is adaptable to respond to any event that could become reality. I appreciate Chairwoman Waters agreeing to this additional language in the bill, as well as her work for a long-term reauthorization. I commend her work here to ensure that this is a bipartisan product here on the House floor. And from time to time, we may not agree, but on this important bill, we do see eye to eye. So bipartisanship is not always dead here in Washington. And I believe this bill, when enacted, will give our economy certainty and will show that we can respond to threats and we can talk across the aisle and come to rational conclusions. So I'd like, again, to thank Chairwoman Waters for engaging in this bipartisan collaborative process to reauthorize this important program. I'm also glad to know that the Senate will be marking up a similar version of the bill this week. That's an encouraging sign. And I'm optimistic it will become law and once it goes to the President's desk in short order. So with that, Mr. Chair, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from North Carolina reserves the balance of time. Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, members, I cannot tell you how pleased I am at the effort that was put together by Mr. McHenry to make this a bipartisan bill. I'm very appreciative for that. And I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, the chairwoman for the Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets.
Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I thank the lady for yielding and for leadership on this issue. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 4634, which would reauthorize the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, or TRIA, for 7 years. I want to thank Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry for working together to reach a compromise on this critically important bill that can get broad bipartisan support. I also thank my colleagues, Congressman Clay and Cleaver, for holding field hearings and their tremendous support. This issue is deeply personal to me because I represent New York City, and I remember all too well the terrorist attack of 9/11. After that terrible attack, the market for terrorism insurance completely shut down. And without terrorism insurance, all construction stopped and thousands of jobs were lost. We could not insure anything. In response, Congress came together in a bipartisan way and passed the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, which provides a government backstop for terrorism insurance. The goal of TRIA was to make terrorism insurance both available and affordable, and that's exactly what has happened because of this bill. And all of this has come at no cost, not one cost whatsoever, to our taxpayers. This bill would reauthorize TRIA for 7 years without any changes to the underlying program. I am pleased that there is broad agreement that the program doesn't need any additional changes. And I would like unanimous consent to place in the record a listing of over 300 major business leaders in our country from every state that is supporting this important legislation. So again, I want to thank Chairwoman Waters for her leadership and Ranking Member McHenry for working with us in good faith to come up with a bipartisan compromise. This bill is incredibly important to our economy. I support it completely. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this bill, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlewoman from New York yields back the balance of time. Gentlewoman from California reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I now yield 3 minutes to the chair of our Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions Subcommittee, Representative Meeks.
Gentleman from New York, the Honorable Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of H.R. 4634, the Terrorism Risk Insurance Program Reauthorization Act of 2019. And let me take my hat off to Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry for working closely together to make sure that this is a bipartisan bill, bringing us all together in that regard, as well as the other chairs of the subcommittees that worked very hard on this bill. Terrorism risk remains real and present. It's a present risk. This is especially true for my loved city of New York, which terrorists seek to target not only for its large population and notable landmarks, but also because they seek to disrupt the New York capital markets, which are the financial nervous system of America and the world. In October, I had the privilege to participate in a New York Police Department counterterrorism unit briefing on the continuing terrorism threats to New York City. There have been dozens of foiled plots and a handful of realized attacks. We cannot let our guard down. TRIA deserves, and in the House, has won broad bipartisan support. Companies and residents of cities and states that are at risk of terrorism urgently need Congress to finalize passage of a clean, long-term reauthorization of TRIA to provide the certainty that they need for long-term planning, and that's exactly what the chair and ranking member have worked so hard to accomplish. As we consider this legislation, it is critical to keep in mind that terrorism insurance is a covenant in many businesses and real estate loans and contracts. And as such, as we saw after the 9/11 attacks on New York, any lapse in risk triggering defaults or freezing commerce and housing markets. Capital markets and insurance policies are typically written on long-term contracts, and so new insurance policies are already being written today that extend beyond the potential expiration date of the current TRIA authorization. As we look at the U.S. economy, we must make sure that not allow any lapse in TRIA which could exacerbate a slowdown. By freezing funding in the real estate market and funding to business and markets considered most at risk, such as in New York. So I close by simply saying, as I started, to the chairwoman who relentlessly worked together with Mr. McHenry to make sure that this is a bill that we could work closely together, because this is a bill that benefits all of us in the United States of America, And that job, is a job well done. And we thank you very much for pulling us together and getting this bill across the finish line. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Well, I yield to my colleague from New York's 1st District, Mr. Zeldin, for as much time as he may consume.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I thank the ranking member and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their passionate advocacy on behalf of this important issue. So I was just listening to my colleague, Gregory Meeks, remind him as he heads towards the back of the chamber, I represent the greatest congressional district in New York, the 1st congressional district of New York. We as New Yorkers, but really all of us in this chamber as Americans, Republicans and Democrats, have worked together and need to continue to work together. Ranking Member McHenry has had a great open door for Republicans to hear our feedback and concerns on this important issue to make sure there isn't a lapse. I'm rising in support of H.R. 4634, the Terrorism Risk Insurance Program Reauthorization Act of 2019, which builds on our continued efforts to keep our promise to the victims of terrorism through the Never Forget the Heroes Act, which was signed into law earlier this year. The U.S. continues to face one of the most challenging threat environments, and terrorists will try to find any way to instill fear and destroy the American values and way of life that we endear and love, cherish. For the terrorists, their efforts include destabilizing our financial markets and economy. We must combat terrorism through every means possible. The Terrorism Risk Insurance Act is a critical insurance backstop that provides important protections for construction jobs, venues, and regional economies across America in the event of a catastrophic terrorist attack. Failure to reauthorize this program could cause major market disruption, which is why I am proud to co-sponsor this important legislation. I'm urging all of my colleagues to support this bill to bolster both our national and economic security. I rise not just as a New Yorker, but with my colleagues together as Americans. I thank the chair and the ranking member, and I yield back.
Gentleman from New York yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker and members, you heard Mr. Meeks a moment ago. You heard from Ms. Maloney, and I can't tell you how much time and effort they have put into making sure that we get TRIA reauthorized. And what's interesting about what happened in our committee, aside from the fact that Mr. McHenry and I worked well together, we had the East and the Midwest working very well together. We had roundtables by Mr. Meeks and Mr. Maloney in New York, and then in Missouri, we had Mr. Cleaver and Mr. Clay working together. So this has been a wonderful opportunity for all of us to work together to see to it we do the right thing as it relates to responding to the possibility of terrorism and how we handle that. So now I yield 3 minutes to the chair of the subcommittee on housing, community development, and insurance, Mr. Clay.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me thank Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry for getting us to this day. The Terrorism Risk Insurance Program before us this afternoon is one of the most important bills in the ongoing fight against terror. TRIA helps to support the private market in providing coverage for terrorism risk by providing federal reinsurance in the event of catastrophic losses from terrorism. The lack of public data on the scope and nature of terrorism risk makes it very difficult for private companies to model these risks, and as a result, a federal backstop is important and necessary. When businesses in my state of Missouri can purchase terrorism risk insurance, it provides confidence, promotes public safety, and undergirds the overall economy. TRIA also protects key healthcare and research facilities in St. Louis who not only work on life-saving cures, but also employ thousands of our constituents. Overall, the TRIA program has been extremely successful in ensuring economic stability in the post-9/11 environment and has done so at virtually no cost to the taxpayer due to its cost-sharing structure. In 2019, the threat of terrorism has not abated, and insurers still face challenges in underwriting a risk with such a high potential loss. Without TRIA, many policyholders in Missouri and elsewhere would lose terrorism coverage, commercial lending would be significantly diminished, and the federal government would likely be called upon to provide assistance at great cost to taxpayers in the event of an attack. And I urge my colleagues to vote for this critical piece of legislation. And, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri yields back balance of time. Gentlewoman from California reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Prepared to close, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlewoman reserves.
Gentlewoman reserves. If the gentleman from North Carolina has more speakers?
I'm prepared to close.
Okay.
So gentlewoman from California reserves.
I reserve the balance of my
Gentleman
time.
from North Carolina is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Chair, this is a very good bill. This is a constructive conversation we've had from the Republicans on the Financial Services Committee and the Democrats on the Financial Services Committee. This was a priority that Chairwoman Waters set out in our first conversation about her agenda for the committee this Congress. This was in an area that I offered to be supportive. And so I'm grateful that we are, in this policy set, a year ahead of time. It is a rare circumstance where Congress has acted so early on a key reauthorization. And it's a rare thing, especially given the import of this Terrorism Risk Insurance Act. And so we are 1 year ahead of schedule in reporting this bill off the House floor. I expect a wide bipartisan vote, thankfully. And I'm grateful that in the committee markup process, we had great bipartisan support. The New York delegation, having experienced 9/11, with three key policy makers from the city, four key policy makers from the city and the New York metro area, very active in the original construct of this bill. Mr. Meeks, Ms. Maloney, Ms. Velasquez on the Democrat side, and Mr. King on the Republican side. And the combination of their expertise and also their legislative history, that they were here and helped construct the original act that we are reauthorizing now today, is quite helpful. And their experience in the immediate reaction of the 9/11 terrorist attacks on New York City, as well as the Pentagon across the street from us or across the river from us here today, and the loss in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. That immediate reaction was swift by Congress and bipartisan. And today we're carrying on that legacy. And I am grateful for it. I think the American people are grateful when we're able to act in that accord. And so this is a very good day of bipartisanship that has taken months to bring us to this type of conclusion. And I do want to thank Chairwoman Waters for her willingness. Look, when you're in the majority, you've got more votes than the minority. That's obvious with being in the majority. So it's not all the time that you reach across the aisle when you're in the majority. I understand that. But in this act, Chairwoman Waters said it's imperative that we work together. And we have. And so we've got a good result here today. I think it shows that the Financial Services Committee, when brought together, we can do big and important things. And this is certainly a big and important thing that will have a lasting impact on the American economy. And we are hopeful. We are hopeful that we will never have to use this piece of law in response to a terrorist attack. But if we are, the work that we've done on committee, on the Financial Services Committee, the expertise that we've had on the committee, we believe means that this act will work in response to some cataclysmic event. We're hopeful, and we plan to ensure that no further terrorist attacks happen or befall our country and our people like happened on 9/11. However, we are also in the disaster planning business as well, and it's important and imperative that members of Congress are engaged in that. And so your Financial Services Committee in this House has come to a good conclusion on a good piece of law, and we have a very good reauthorization. So, Mr. Chair, I encourage a yes vote by all members, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields back the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am so pleased and so proud that we're on the floor today on a bipartisan bill, and certainly expect the support from both sides of the aisle. America stands united against terrorism and the hatred and violence that it represents, and we're stronger as a country when we take steps to ensure that our country can quickly respond to terrorism. By reauthorizing TRIA, we're helping to do just that. Again, I'd like to thank Ranking Member McHenry for working with me on this important bill, as well as all of the members on our committee who have shown real leadership on this issue. You heard from some of them today, particularly Representative Maloney, who had worked for a long time on this legislation. This was so important to her. Mr. Cleaver, Mr. Clay, Mr. Meeks, all of them have contributed mightily to the organizing of this bill, to working out any difficulties that we may have had, and I'm very pleased about that. And once again, I must say to Mr. McHenry, we have shown that it is possible. Despite the fact that we may not agree on a lot of other things, we came together on this legislation. We agreed, we worked together, we provided leadership and inspiration to others, understanding that this was possible. So I would urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this important piece of legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from California yields back the balance of her time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 4634 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended.
I request a recorded vote.
Does the gentlewoman request the yeas and nays?
Yes.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking these votes by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20, further proceedings on this will be postponed.
5, the nays are 22. 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote